Good evening, ladies and gentlemen and brethren. Welcome to this evening's Solomon Live. We shall begin in just a few minutes' time. We just do a usual thing beforehand to make sure that everybody is in place. And our special guest this evening, Deputy Grand Secretary of UGLE, very worshipful brother, Graham Redman. We'll talk about Masonic howlers, but at the beginning, we shall get to know Graham a little bit more. We'll begin in just a few minutes' time. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen and brethren. Thank you very much indeed if you've just joined us. We shall be beginning in around 2 minutes' time. And our special guest this evening, Deputy Grand Secretary of UGLE, very worshipful brother, Graham Redman. So get yourself settled, perhaps a beverage in one hand, and we shall begin in just a few minutes' time. A very warm welcome to those who have just joined us. This evening Solomon Live will begin in just a moment. In time-honored fashion, we're just ensuring that we have you in place and you do not miss anything before we start this evening Solomon Live. Ladies and gentlemen and brethren, we will begin any time now. Thank you very much indeed. Ladies, gentlemen, brethren, good evening and welcome to this evening's Solomon Live. We are live across the UK, indeed live across the world. My name is Brodie. I have the honour of being the Provincial Communications Officer for the distinguished province of Worcestershire and also the host of these monthly webinars of lively Freemasonry conversation. And before I begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everybody who came over to chat to me at Quarterly Communications a few weeks ago, just to simply say how much they enjoyed Solomon Live. That meant the world to me and indeed the team who make this happen every single month. Now you can submit your questions this evening to our very special guest via the question and answer facility on Zoom. So let's begin. This evening Solomon Live is Masonic howlers and how to avoid them. And please welcome our very special guest this evening, Deputy Grand Secretary of UGLE, very worshipful brother, Graham Redman. Graham, how are you?
I'm fine at the moment.
It will be completely fine. Now, Graham, in time-honoured fashion, sorry, Graham, before I begin, can I just check something, if you don't mind? Just if there's a section on how to interview a Deputy Grand Secretary in this wonderful book. Nothing in there so far.
That will be the second edition.
So let's begin by getting to know you a little bit. So tell me about your Masonic journey. When were you initiated and why did you join in the first place?
I went into my old school lodge in May 1973 when I was 24. So the mathematicians in the audience will be able to work out that I'm within spitting distance of 50 years.
And have you enjoyed it all the way through, Graham? Because clearly to reach your high office, it's something that you must enjoy doing.
Most of the time, there is nothing which is 100% solid enjoyment every minute. And I've done one or two fairly hair-raising things in my Masonic career as well, but I've survived.
And that's good to see. And what made you join Masonry? What was that hook that got you into the fraternity, Graham?
Well, my father was a Mason. He died while I was at school, so I didn't go into his lodge, but I went to an Old Bedfordians Club dinner, and it so happened that I sat next to the secretary of the lodge. And my first experience of Masonic mugging. One of the good things about my old school lodge is that it didn't have and doesn't have an enormous waiting list. Actually, waiting lists are pretty uncommon these days. But 50 years ago, most lodges had a waiting list of 3 or 4 or 5 years. As it was, I was in the lodge within just over 6 months, I think.
And we know about your distinguished background in Freemasonry, but let's talk about your work life, your career.
Well, most of that's actually been working at Freemasons Hall. But when I came down from Oxford, I qualified as a barrister, and I spent about 4 years in pupillage and practice before I went off into industry. And after another 7 years or so, the company I worked for was taken over. And I was approached by Sir Kenneth Newton and Commander Michael Hyam, who were the president of the Board of General Purposes and the then Grand Secretary. And they asked if I was interested in working at Freemasons Hall.
Wow. And how did you react to that nice tap on the shoulder to invite you?
Say that again?
How did you react when you were offered that wonderful opportunity?
I was flattered, but I have to tell you, I thought quite hard about whether it was an offer I would be wise to accept, because what you do for pleasure is one thing. When you have to do it, it doesn't become. It's no longer pure, unmitigated pleasure. You can't suit yourself. You have to do what you're told. And there are, I'm afraid, in Masonic administration, some things which are not a lot of fun when you have to roll your sleeves up and get your hands dirty.
That's a really good point, though, isn't it? What you've mentioned about doing it professionally and enjoying it. And sometimes it can take the edge off it. But look at where you are today, Graham. Things are certainly going well.
It didn't take all the edge off it for me.
So we've got to know you a little bit, but let's continue getting to know you some more. So honorary memberships, how many lodges and chapters would you say you're a part of when you last counted?
I have lost count of the honorary memberships. Every time I've been a consecrating officer of a lodge, bar one, I have been elected to honorary membership. I've received an honorary membership from one or two that I've attended a centenary of, and one or two who appear to have no particular reason for making me an honorary member have done that too. So countless lodges and chapters of which I'm an honorary member. And I think I'm currently a subscribing member of 10 and 2 chapters.
Oh.
And then there are other orders as well.
And do you find you have the time to visit them accordingly?
The lodges I belong to, by and large, I try to get to every meeting. The lodges I'm an honorary member of, it's a bit different. If I tried to attend every lodge of which I'm an honorary member, I'd be out every night and I'd be a nervous wreck.
Absolutely. And you're Deputy Grand Secretary, which is an incredibly important job within Freemasonry. What does that job entail, Graham?
Almost anything. I'm the corporate memory because I'm the longest serving senior member of the Grand Secretary's staff, and I'm supposed to be the man who knows all the answers. I don't always. Sometimes I have to scratch my head and think. But so, corporate memory, in a way, jack of all trades. There are questions that arise in almost every field, whether it's a matter of procedure, whether it's to do with the registration system. I'm there. I get the questions thrown at me. I also deal with the Masonic discipline system, and that can be interesting, but that's one of those things where I roll up my sleeves and get my hands sometimes very dirty indeed.
Oh, I can only imagine, but your Masonic knowledge is nothing short of phenomenal. And we heard your mention at Quality Link Communications. You're clearly very much
I found a howler for you, Brodie.
Oh, go on.
4 times a year, we hold a quarterly communication, singular.
Ah.
So
and I just added an S to it, sir.
So right. There you are. You'll now avoid one of the Masonic pitfalls for the future.
I knew this Solomon Live would be worth its weight in gold. I really did. But did you hear that mention? How did that make you feel to know that you were acknowledged in such a big way?
Are you talking about June?
Just gone in September, and indeed beforehand.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't particularly acknowledged in September, but in June, Peter Lowndes said nice things about me.
And let's talk about your responsibility with Royal Arch as well. So how does that work, Graham?
Pretty well, it exactly mirrors what I do in the craft. Now, certain of the offices in Grand Chapter are automatically held by a particular officer in Grand Lodge. So the Grand Master is the first Grand Principal, the Pro-Grand Master, Pro-First Grand Principal. Grand Secretary, if qualified, is the Grand Scribe Ezra. The Grand Registrar is the Grand Registrar. The Grand Treasurer is the Grand Treasurer. But an awful lot of offices don't follow automatically, but as a matter of pure practicality, if you hold an office in the craft, by and large, you hold it in the Royal Arch. So I'm Deputy Grand Scribe Ezra, and before I became Deputy Grand Secretary, I was Assistant Grand Scribe Ezra. The Grand Director of Ceremonies and his deputies don't have to be the same in the Royal Arch, but they always are.
Well, that's good. That's good to hear, because there will be a lot of people joining us this evening who didn't know that. But let's talk about this book. Thousands of people have this in their collection. I've had it for many years, and we need to discuss why you decided to write this in the first place.
Back in, I think, 2008, I finished and published a book called Emulation Working Today. And it so happened that getting it off to the publisher coincided with my annual leave. And I felt withdrawal symptoms. So I thought, is there something else I could do? And I had a word with my publisher and said, I suppose I could write a book about what I do in my everyday life, but I don't think it'll sell. He said, I think it'll sell better than your ritual book. Am I glad or am I sorry? He was absolutely right.
And do you know how many it has sold over the years?
I tried to find that out from my publisher over the weekend, and his estimate was, I think, a little bit on the low side, because he thought 5,000 or 6,000. I managed to find a royalty statement, which is about 2 years old, which suggests I'd sold over 7,000 at that stage. However, he did assure me that they printed 10,000. So depending how many people have been snapping up in the last few days, there may or may not still be some available to be bought.
It's an incredible number, though, isn't it, of people who have got this book in their collection. How does that make you feel that it's been so well received and a very much loved book?
I'm quite pleased about that. I have to say, if I'd written a book about cookery or gardening that had penetrated the market to that extent, I could probably have retired on the proceeds, because it's a niche market. I also wrote the book in partial self-protection, because I used to get a lot of telephone calls from provincial Grand Secretaries saying, we've got this situation, what do we do? And nowadays, when I get the call, it's, well, you say on page 98, but what if? So we've started quite a long way towards the answer before I actually have to open my mouth on that. And every so often, I think that was rather an interesting question that I've just been asked. I better put it in the next edition. And I've got quite often got out the book to see where it would fit in best. And actually, it was there all along. The idiot hadn't actually spotted it.
No, well, we'll get to some questions in a moment. Graham, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed for submitting those questions. In time-honoured fashion, ladies and gentlemen and brethren, we will not get through all of them. We won't even scratch the surface, but I'll do my very best. So before we launch into one or two questions, why is Masonic etiquette, Graham, so important? Why is Masonic etiquette so important?
It's all to do with structure and also to do with consistency. Now, etiquette is actually something that can be used in a variety of different ways. So it can just refer to rules or protocol, or what is just pure etiquette, which by and large is good manners. If I give you an example, if you've got a wheel, rules and protocol come from the hub in the center. Etiquette, however, tends to grow up along the spokes and along the rim, so that it's local. And local doesn't necessarily mean geographically local. You can have two lodges meeting in the same place, where their etiquette is slightly different. So, for example, dress code. If a lodge meets in dinner jackets, it's bad manners, if you've got one, to turn up in a lounge suit. If they meet in lounge suits, it's bad manners to turn up in a dinner jacket. That's the sort of thing. Now, etiquette, because it's on the rim or on the spokes, is always evolving. And it sometimes quite quickly.
Well, that's a really good answer, isn't it? And especially when it comes to looking at the local discipline, if you will, and following suit. Now, this would seem a random question, but I'm going to scatter those in throughout our conversation, Graham. So John Norris would like to ask you, sir, what is the protocol, as far as you're aware, for wearing multiple collars in a lodge where a member holds 2 or more offices? How do you feel about that?
Strictly speaking, you should wear all the collars. So you start with your undergarments, so to speak, which is the apron and the collar of your rank. And on top of it, you wear the collar of any office you hold. The interesting question, of course, is in what order do you wear them?
Yes.
And properly, it, I think, should be the senior office. But if you think about an installation meeting, if somebody's invested as, let's say, a senior warden and is then subsequently invested also as charity steward, the collars will be put on the wrong way round. But at the next meeting, you should have the senior wardens on top. Of course, if you're not careful, you end up with a dreadful stoop and a stiff neck if you have too many officers.
Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed for asking that wonderful question. And one more before we move on. And what are the protocols for wearing jewels in a lodge, please?
Right.
And this is from Philip Shred. Thank you, Philip.
The rule is that you can wear any jewel which pertains to pure ancient masonry. So any craft or Royal Arch jewel which is approved for wearing. In practice, that things have changed enormously since the 19th century and the early 20th century, when people used to have an absolute multitude of jewels pinned on their breast, or very often on a piece of separate material pre-pinned, which could then be fitted on over your pocket. And astonishingly, these people still managed to walk upright rather than with a perpetual list support.
Oh, thank you.
But in practice nowadays, less is more.
Yes.
And the custom is for grand officers, the Royal Arch jewel. We like people to wear the tercentenary jewel if they're entitled to it. It's good manners if you're not a grand officer and the lodge has presented you with a past master's jewel. It's good manners to wear it in that lodge. If you've got a multiplicity of past masters jewels and centenary jewels and charity jewels, you really do need to exercise a certain amount of discretion rather than walking around like a Christmas tree.
Graham, thank you very much. We'll get back to some more of your questions, ladies and gentlemen and brethren. As I alluded to, I will only be able to scratch the surface. We are getting so many in, which is what we expected. Now, Graham, you're the man known as the man who knows everything about the Book of Constitutions. How do you react to that wonderful compliment?
Well, it's nice to be regarded in that light. Yes, I probably do know most things about it. Every so often I do get caught out on something. So one of the important messages, all to do with avoiding the faux pas, is don't assume that you know what is in the Book of Constitutions. Just look at the rule and see. Don't rely on your memory. Certainly don't rely on what other people have told you, because they've probably misremembered and then got it wrong on top of it. So, yeah. But yes, I do know a lot about the Book of Constitutions. The scurrilous have even suggested that's because I wrote most of it. But it's not quite true. I did have to do the amendments for the introduction of the Metropolitan Grand Lodge and Grand Chapter of London. And we had, would you believe, 32 pages of amendments for the craft rules and 16 pages of amendments for the Royal Arch rules.
Wow, that's incredible. That really is. And we need to talk about your involvement with Hermes as well, Graham, because for those who are not aware, this is the system for secretaries to do their paperwork, essentially, and a lot of etiquette involved in that and protocol. You were involved in that quite heavily, weren't you?
Well, I still am, because I'm part of the project steering group. And my line has been all along, if we've got Hermes right, virtually every lodge secretary, however inept in the IT sense, should be able intuitively to find his way through Hermes. If he can't, we've not really done our job properly. And it involved, at the beginning, a very great deal of examination of the old-fashioned paper processes, and then converting them into processes which replicate the essentials of the paper process, but using an electronic format. And it's gradually
how would you
being
like to see
rolled
this
out.
develop in the future, Graham? How would you like to see this when it's where it should be, if you will?
Say that again? Sorry.
So how would you like to see the end result of Hermes when things have progressed further?
Well, as I say, if we've got it right, everybody will be able to follow it. And with any luck, it will eliminate an awful lot of the errors that people make. It should be quite impossible, for example, to do a passing less than 28 days after an initiation, or a raising less than 28 days after a passing, because Hermes won't let you.
Well, that's good. That's good to hear the final detail. And let's get back to general etiquette, ma'am. What would you say is the number one thing us as Freemasons fall down on when it comes to etiquette?
Well, I think it's probably failing to look and check what is in the rules. But there's also a certain amount of vanity involved. I say in my book, with the exception of grand rank, there's nothing that excites people more than the regalia they can wear. As I say, vanity. We all like to show off. We all like to dress up, actually. It's a Masonic characteristic. There are other things that irritate me enormously. And I gave an example of people turning up to a lodge that meets in a dinner jackets in a lounge suit. And you do see that, unfortunately. And sometimes there's a sort of element of militancy about it. I'm going to wear what I want, and that's not quite how it should be. We are all trying to accommodate each other. We're trying to be happy and communicate happiness to others, not saying, I'm better than you.
Yeah. We
are all brothers.
That's a really good point. A really good point. Graham, during your long and illustrious Masonic career, and of course, we really don't want to name anybody. Well, I don't think so. What's the biggest faux pas you've ever seen? What would you say?
Not sure that I would want to say it.
Is that one for another version of the show?
It is a tricky one. Little things. The Programme Master before Lord Farnham was Lord Cadogan, and every so often you hear someone refer to him as the Earl of Cadogan, which is not right. That's a small faux pas. I've made the odd faux pas. I went, probably about 2004, 2005, to a secretary's lodge in a province. It was the installation meeting. I was giving a talk on, I think, the Book of Constitutions, and they wore undress. 5 years later, when I'd written my etiquette book, I went to the same lodge, installation meeting again. So got on the train with my regalia and the summons, and I opened the summons, and it said full dress regalia. So there I was at the meeting with one other grand officer wearing undress and everybody else in full dress. That's all right. The Book of Constitutions says very clearly that except on certain occasions where, unless it's impracticable, you shall wear full dress, you have a complete freedom of choice whether you wear dress or undress. But it was a faux pas, but I was failing in the etiquette because I should have conformed to the lodge's dress code, even if they had been misguided in changing it over the 5 years.
Now, this question from Oliver is a very interesting question to follow. Where can the line be drawn with regards to etiquette between variation between lodges and wrong etiquette?
I missed the word that you last used to qualify etiquette.
Yeah. So, where can the line be drawn with regards to etiquette between variation between lodges and wrong etiquette?
Again, it's that word immediately before etiquette. I didn't quite catch it. Old age,
wrong etiquette.
Wrong etiquette. Ah, right. If it's wrong, it's not etiquette. You can't altogether answer that. I mean, I've given you examples like failing to observe the dress code. There is a distinct difference, though, between, let's say, protocol and etiquette. Protocol is laid down centrally, so you'll annoy somebody relatively senior, possibly in the provincial hierarchy, if you disregard it. Bits of etiquette don't carry quite the same level of risk with them. Mobile telephones are something that irritate me. There are people who are sitting in, we hope, in the back row, but sometimes they're not in the back row, and they're tapping away on their mobiles, and that is appalling. Bad manners. Even if the thing doesn't go off noisily, interrupting the ceremony, it's wrong. And one of the nice things when I was a young Mason, and you didn't have mobile telephones, or the mobile telephones you had were about the size of a brick. And then the door of the lodge closed and the world was shut out.
Yes.
And you could just concentrate on a nice, relaxing meeting, watching a ceremony. Now, unfortunately, we've lost a bit of that.
And well, one of the reasons I love going to a Masonic meeting is because you've just alluded to, you can shut out whatever's going out in the real world. And I guess that includes mobile phones as well. How do you feel, Graham, about tutting during a ceremony?
Well, it's always tempting. But my experience is that on the whole, those who know most about what should be done right are the least likely to tut. It's only those who think they know how the ceremony should be done who tut when somebody doesn't do it the way they think. And within reason, I tend to suck my teeth rather than tut, which is much quieter. And my friends tell me sometimes I pull faces. But tutting, if it's too audible, and tutting, actually a form of tutting is to mutter to your neighbour that, no, he obviously hasn't bothered to read the book. So tutting does cover a variety of things. It's not terribly good manners again. And very often it's taking advantage of somebody who's actually doing his best.
Yes.
I've got endless sympathy with a master who's ritualistically inept, but really is trying, and he's performing to 95% of his capacity. And you don't tut or do anything to put him off, but there are one or two rather smug individuals who are pretty good at ritual, just can't be bothered to polish it up and make a really good job of it. And they irritate me enormously. So they deserve an occasional tut, just to punish them.
Well, Graham, we have got, can you believe we've been talking for half an hour already? We've got around 15 minutes, many more questions to get to, or, well, we're going to have to get you back on. So, but let's continue with talking about festive boards. Now, for many Freemasons, the festive board, after the ceremony, after the work in the lodge room, is a time to relax and catch up with your friends and engage in witty banter. What Masonic etiquette do you think is essential within a festive board?
Not to do anything that's going to offend people.
Very good one. Please elaborate.
Right. Rowdiness. You sometimes get a little group on a sprig who are no doubt enjoying themselves amongst themselves, but they're actually making such a noise that they're distracting other people. I can remember a most unedifying scene. The very first centenary I attended officially, where a small fight broke out during the toasts, and that just is not on. I'm not terribly keen on telling stories at dinner. Some stories are completely clean and quite amusing, but there is a danger that young brethren get the wrong idea and think telling a story is pretty well de rigueur, and then you start a race to the bottom. And then you I can remember one story where I was sitting next to the provincial Grand Secretary, and it was so inappropriate that he pretended not to understand it.
And probably a wise move. And how do you feel about speeches, length? Because there's a bit of etiquette there as well, isn't there?
Again, by and large, these days, less is more. You do get people saying, gosh, when I was new in the craft, I remember we had wonderful speeches. I doubt if they really were. It's just rose-tinted spectacles. And my strong suspicion is that really good speakers were just as rare then as they are now. And it's much better, if you're not a natural speaker, to speak to the point, and having made your point, propose the toast or whatever and sit down.
I think we've, and I think everyone who's a Freemason on Solomon Live this evening has been to that festive board where the speech went on perhaps a little longer than it should. And let's continue with etiquette, but protocol. Let's talk about women in Freemasonry now. What is the protocol for us to interact with the two women Grand Lodges?
Right. We obviously cannot directly recognize them. We cannot intervisit. However, we do have cordial relations with the two women's Grand Lodges in this country. And from time to time, there's an exchange of ideas. The cooperation has become much more marked in recent years because it's not uncommon with the university's scheme to have a stall at the Freshers' Fair to draw the attention of freshmen to the existence of Freemasonry. But I'm afraid universities tend to be politically correct and they don't want a stall for something which is one sex only. And so what we now tend to have is a Masonic stall with us and one or other of the, or both even, of the women's Grand Lodges represented. And that gets round the opposition from the universities and is to the mutual benefit of both us and the Lady Masons.
Makes complete sense, doesn't it? Back to the questions. And what's your opinion on Masonic rings?
Masonic rings?
Because there's a lot of those around, isn't there? Yeah. What's your opinion on those?
There's only one Masonic ring. Well, can't see it properly. Worth wearing, but I don't like them with Masonic emblems on. And indeed, some of our forefathers recognized that because you had reversible rings where you could actually pivot the Masonic emblem and just show a plain gold or black or whatever background instead. It isn't only rings, cufflinks, lapel badges, all these things. The Board of General Purposes has always regarded them as matters of personal choice, rather reluctant to say you're not to wear Masonic rings or you mustn't wear Masonic cufflinks or lapel badges. I can think of one instance where we did discourage cufflinks, and that was a manufacturer who was trying to sell Hallstone jewel cufflinks. And we took the view that the Hallstone jewel is very special. It's associated with those lodges that contributed to the building of Freemasons Hall. And Freemasons Hall was the Great Masonic Peace Memorial, a memorial actually to the dead in the First World War. And wearing that particular emblem on cufflinks, the board felt was not appropriate. Otherwise, it's a matter of personal taste. Yeah. Again, if you want to be dripping with bling, that's your affair.
Oh, thank you so much, and thank you for that question. Now, we briefly talked about this general communications, the digital world that we live in, and I've often thought, Graham, that whatever you put out onto social media, you're representing Freemasonry. That's always been my angle on that. How do you feel about general communications in the online world when it comes to Masonic etiquette?
Well, I don't do social media myself. That's a personal choice. I'd rather think I've got other and better things to do with my time. You do see people walking down the street, not necessarily steering a straight course, and they're tapping away at their mobiles on whatever particular social medium they prefer. They can be very useful for getting a good message across. They can be horribly dangerous when the message is bad. Don't want to get political, but Leicester very recently had some disruption between the Hindu and the Muslim population, all fanned by social media, which was misrepresenting the position. And so I'm quite nervous of social media, but that's my choice. And I wouldn't condemn somebody who makes appropriate posts, but you are absolutely right. Everything that you post, if people know you're a Mason, they will attribute to Freemasonry. And so, in a way, the lowest can affect the standing of the highest.
Yes. Now, Graham, I can't believe this. We've got just around 5 minutes to go. So I'll get through as many questions as I possibly can. Let's talk about the issues of going abroad and visiting other lodges in a different country, because there's a lot of etiquette stroke protocol with that, isn't there?
Yep, there are, of course, numerous Grand Lodges. There are far more irregular Grand Lodges around the world than there are regular. So if you're going to go visiting abroad, you should find out through your provincial office, find out through the province from the Grand Secretary's office, which is the appropriate Grand Lodge that we recognize. And there is a convention that we in Great Queen Street can set up a meeting for you to attend before you enter the territory. Only when you're in the territory can you make direct contact with that Grand Lodge. If you're doing it remotely, one country to another, the communication lies between two Grand Secretaries. But once you're in their territory, then it is legitimate for you to get in touch with the Grand Secretary in the country you're visiting. You will need to be provided, you'll need to provide yourself with your Grand Lodge certificate, some means of identification, and also something which will indicate that you are in good standing with your lodge. Basic principle, that's what we expect of foreign visitors, and we don't do to others what we wouldn't have them do to us.
That's a really good analogy, Graham. Now, COVID advice, special measures, I would assume you were a massive part of that time in our life.
Yes.
Take me through that and where we are today.
Well, fortunately, we're pretty well out of that particular tunnel. Before we actually went into lockdown, people were starting to get nervous because the reports were coming in of people getting COVID abroad, and they got nervous about attending meetings. So I did some fairly short guidance on abandoning meetings. You can't cancel in advance, but you can abandon if you can't get the necessary quorum, which is 5 people, of whom 2 must be members of the lodge. Then we went into lockdown, and I did a set of questions and answers, frequently asked questions. As we were emerging from lockdown, I produced some resumption frequently asked questions with a sort of preface saying, these are the things that you have got to do. And that was quite a lot of work. It was a matter of giving advice as to what was the appropriate course to follow. What was interesting is the Book of Constitutions did turn out to be pretty robust. It would certainly answer pretty well every question that arose. The answer wasn't always the one that people wanted, but at least it provided certainty.
Yes.
And because one of the things that people were getting exercised about was somebody stuck in the chair for 3 years in a row, we did introduce some special measures. We introduced special measures to allow a Zoom meeting in conjunction with a quorum meeting of a lodge, which would enable more members to participate. We produced a special measure which enabled a lodge to install a master at the first opportunity if the outgoing master would have continued for a 3rd year.
Yes.
So various things that we did. And then when we got to resumption, then I produced a template for actually tidying things up at the end of the whole lockdown and getting back onto a straight course, which I think we are pretty well back on now, though it's quite noticeable some elderly brethren are still nervous about attending meetings. And anecdotally, more so in the Royal Arch than in the craft. Which is possibly because the average age in the Royal Arch is a bit higher.
Yes.
So, yes, an interesting time.
Well, Graham, on behalf of
I sat in the very room I'm doing this interview from, doing all the concocting of these various rules and measures and advice.
Well, on behalf of everybody who was around during that time, we can't thank you enough for your guidance and your support during that period. I'm going to break my code here, Graham, and my rule, and ask one more question because we've hit the 45-minute time, which is what we try and stick to. So one more question, and a lot of people would like me to ask you this. What advice would you give to a new Mason learning the ceremonies, particularly because you've received the ultimate pat on the back when it comes to your silver matchbox? So a piece of advice for anybody who's joining us now, new Mason, older Mason alike.
Read it through often. Make sure you understand what it is you're saying. You'll be surprised at some interesting emphases that I've heard in lodge, which actually make a nonsense of the words. My own way of learning things, and it's very much a personal thing, is if I've got a new piece of ritual to learn, I'll read it through last thing at night before I turn off the light for about a fortnight, and then it swirls around in the subconscious. I'm afraid then you've got to sit down with the book and learn it almost by rote. But the most important thing is to understand what it is that the piece of ritual is saying, because that will enable you to keep pretty well on course, but it will also mean that you will hold the attention of the people who are listening to you. And
Thank you.
always remember that when you do any ritual, your true focus is the candidate.
Yes.
Eye-to-eye contact is very important. And that's why we do it from memory.
Graham, our time is done. Have you, sir, enjoyed your Solomon Live experience?
I have enjoyed it, yes. Do I want to come back, which you hinted at? I think that's entirely a question for you.
Well, the answer for me, sir, is a big yes, because I didn't get through many of my questions. There were so many questions that I didn't get to on the chat screen. So I think we should absolutely make that happen again one day. Graham, thank you so much for joining us this evening on Solomon Live. Ladies and gentlemen and brethren, the next Solomon Live will be Tuesday, the 18th of October, where we will discuss Black Freemasonry in the USA, where we will meet James Morgan III, Grand Historian and Archivist of the most worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia. In typical fashion, one not to be missed. Please put that date in your diary. That's Tuesday, the 18th of October at 7:30. As always, if you haven't done so already, please make sure that you register for Solomon, solomon.ugle.org.uk. Loads of reasons to track that down and enhance your Masonic knowledge. Until then, thank you ever so much indeed for joining us this evening, and we shall see you back here very, very soon. Thank you.